Welcome to Resilient Places in the United States, What Works and What Doesn't. Hello, my name is Maya Newman, and I am a physician of physical medicine and rehabilitation who is now training in the specialty of pediatric rehabilitation. I am lucky to be a part of Sustain Our Abilities, and I have been helping to coordinate Day for Tomorrow. I am currently in my hometown of Seattle, Washington. Today, I have the privilege to be with Mike McGinn, lawyer, former mayor of Seattle, Sierra Club state chair, neighborhood activist, founder of sustainability nonprofit Great City, host of a podcast on social change named You, Me, Us Now, and currently the executive director of American Walks, a national nonprofit that advocates for safe, equitable, accessible, and walkable communities. Welcome, Mr. McGinn. We are so happy to have you with us today for Day for Tomorrow. We have presentations from all over the world. You offer a unique American perspective as a local advocate, former mayor, and a national nonprofit leader. Would you like to share some introductory thoughts?
Sure. And, I'm really honored to be here as well. And when I see the lineup of people speaking from around the country, around the world, it's important that I put the caveat around my remarks that I can only speak from my own experiences in the United States. But having said that, I've been working on climate change issues for a really long time, not as long as others, but it was probably the early 2000s when it became clear to me how pressing climate change was as an issue and that we needed to do something about it. And when you look at it, you realize it's against a backdrop of inequity and racism, frankly. And that makes the solutions that's much more challenging and also makes the impacts that much more inequitable as well. So, if we look at it globally, wealthy countries like the US have much higher emissions per capita than many other countries in the globe, yet it'll be, poor people or disadvantaged populations that may take the greatest impacts of those changes. And I know that's something that the Paris Accord wants to get at, but it's also extremely challenging, but necessary for those benefited, from the excessive use of fossil fuels, be supporting and financing the changes that will stop climate change and also mitigate its impacts on people. And that global perspective is also true in the United States as well. We have seen in this country over the last several decades an extraordinary rise in inequality, a shrinking middle class, a very, very wealthy elite that's growing, and a growing population that's faces really severe economic stresses. And just like worldwide, those populations, ones that are lower income populations or Black or brown or Native populations that have been pushed into certain neighborhoods which are not as resilient as other neighborhoods, are going to be feeling the biggest impacts from climate change. So that international challenge is the same challenge we face in the U.S. at a national level or at a local level. Who pays for services and who benefits from services is fought out, at the national level, at the state level, and in every city and town as well. And trying to address climate change, what I've learned over the years is trying to address climate change means you end up having to address, just of necessity, you have to address issues of inequity and racism, because you just can't get from here to there in terms of building a community that works for everyone. So with that backdrop, let's go into the questions, Maya. Let's and have a conversation about this.
Thank you. So with that background, can you please tell us about the work you've been involved in, specifically relating to climate change or natural disasters?
Sure, and I think it's come in a bunch of different ways. Certainly on climate, if you look at the city of Seattle, which I've been most engaged in, we've been fortunate to have water power here in this city for our electricity. So the majority of our emissions come from transportation. But if you look at the nation as a whole, coal and oil power plants, as well as natural gas power plants, and natural gas distribution to households is a very significant source of emissions. Transportation now nationally, I think, is still 40%. So I've worked at different aspects of it, but probably the one I've worked on the most is how do we build communities in which we can reduce the use of fossil fuels and reduce emissions. And that tends to be, we're not going to solve it all with electric cars. It is communities in which people can reach all of their daily needs by walking, biking, moving or rolling, if they need assistance in some way, and that it also connects to transit. That's accessible transit to all as well. That can take them from one neighborhood to the other. And internationally, we now see the popularity of a new idea called the 15-minute neighborhood. It's actually a very, very old idea that we should be able to live in places that have everything you need within walking distance. And so I've done a lot of that work in the city of Seattle, and that's one of the reasons why I became so engaged in forming my own nonprofit. Because it turns out that, we have lots of laws in this country that are designed to divide neighborhoods from each other, divide uses from each other, and essentially make it almost impossible to get around unless you drive. So there's a whole host of different laws around that. So your zoning laws that say this neighborhood can only be for single families living in a house. In fact, if you have too many unrelated people in the house, you're breaking the law. That's a common law across this country. The other issue is required parking minimums. Everybody has to build parking spaces to go with their businesses and/or apartment buildings. Well, when you build all those parking spaces, you raise the cost of housing, and you also start using up lots of land for parking, which separates all the uses from each other. Mm-hmm. Or we ban small businesses or home businesses from forming. If you want a business, it has to be here. So you get this situation where you get lots of housing in one place, and the businesses, say the mall, is in another place, almost requires driving. And these are all built into our land use laws. And they're also oftentimes built into the land use laws because people of means, people who had money, wanted single family zones to prevent poor people from being able to move into an apartment or a smaller home or a shared home of some kind. And we also had the history of redlining, which is still reflected today, in which, Black or brown people or immigrants of some kind were restricted to certain neighborhoods, not just by law, but by all the financing mechanisms and the practices that occurred to who could create wealth. So I've always been a huge advocate for, if you can build a place where people can meet all their needs locally, that's a community where, as I said, people can walk or move or roll in some way to get where they're going. That's just going to be a much, much more resilient world than one where people have to get into an automobile, particularly when significant portion of the population, whether due to age, or disability or income, can't afford a car. So that world creates a world of haves and have-nots. And, of course, having a car is seen as a sign of status and making it. But what kind of making it is it when you're leaving so many people out of what it means to be part of community and share in the wealth of the community? So that's not quite getting to all of the emergency disaster stuff. There's a lot to emergency preparation. But what we know is that in any, immediate disaster, in our case in Seattle, we'd expect an earthquake. People and their neighbors are going to have to rely on each other for up to a week or two. And building these types of resilient neighborhoods where people know each other, where people can share with each other what they have while waiting for relief to come is going to be more resilient than a neighborhood that isn't like that.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to get back to the neighborhood in a minute, but I hear you talking a lot about urban planning and how that impacts the climate and people's health. And I want you to talk about how some of these examples specifically relate to people with physical disabilities.
Yeah. Well, it absolutely does. And one of the things that I think is underappreciated is that when you design something that works for everybody, it actually works better for everybody. And universal design is just absolutely critical. In the streetscape, we've started, and many cities, including ours, are far from completing putting curb cuts into sidewalks. And I'm using this more as an example. It's just one small example. But when you put the curb cut in, that works for the mom or dad with a stroller. That works for the kid on a bicycle. It just works better for everybody. It works for somebody moving into the house with the dolly full of stuff. I look at our household appliances now, and I remember what can openers were like when I was growing up. They were these flimsy metal things. Now they're these more solid things, and makes it easier for somebody who may not have the same grip strength or ability to use the can opener. You know what? Everybody uses that can opener now. It's a better can opener for everybody. And I think we need to bring that aspect to everything we do. A transit system that is, frequent, reliable. You know how long it's going to take because there's a bus lane. It's not getting caught in traffic. You know that you're not going to have to wait more than 10 minutes or so for a bus. That maybe has level boarding platforms so that you can roll up to the platform and, the doors, multiple boarding doors. So that's another good example of if we designed a transit system that worked really great for people in wheelchairs or people that were blind, we would be building a transit system that every user would go, wow, this is such a higher quality and such a higher grade. I'd like to use that. As opposed, again, to building a system that relies on automobiles, which just right from the beginning excludes a lot of people from something. And of course, it would be cheaper for everybody to have a good transit system. It would be cheaper for everybody if they could get to a place in their neighborhood, no matter who they were. And we also have to remember, at some point in almost everyone's life, you're going to need all of that assistance as well. And I'm getting old enough to have those reminders for myself that this is not an us versus them. It is indeed an all of us. All of us at one stage or another, either as an individual or with a family member, are going to be confronting these challenges. And if you design it in from the start to work for those with any type of physical disability or even a mental disability, if you're cognizant of that and supporting that, you're probably building, I shouldn't say probably, you are definitely building a better place for everyone else in the community. So that requires, of course, people to, open up their ears and open up their eyes and really understand and the needs of individuals that have physical disabilities of some type that they need to have addressed, or their advocates. It's just, you don't know what you don't experience oftentimes. So you're going to have to reach out and get that experience and make it more of a bottom-up listening process than a top-down, we think we know what's best for everybody. Odds are you don't. I can assure you, one of the things I learned as mayor was, you think you're coming in, you run, and when you're running for office, you're telling everybody you got all the answers. That's how you get the votes, right? Well, here's my plan. And then you get into office and you realize how extraordinarily complex it is and how much help you need from community leaders to really understand and tackle the problems we have. So all of us can adopt a little bit of that mindset when we're looking at how to build a better place.
So you mentioned help and how in order to get things done, we need a community helping each other.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about what the community perspective for local neighborhoods, what can they do to help advocate for persons with disabilities in the event of natural disasters?
Yeah. There was something that we did here in the city of Seattle. Well, there's a few things that I would say. One is that you actually have to know your neighbors. One of the things that we have seen during the pandemic, which has been, obviously it's an extraordinary tragedy with so many lives lost, But with the stay-at-home orders, everything became more localized. And in order to get exercise, walking was okay. So people were now spending most of their time, they were working from home and staying in their neighborhoods if they could. Some people couldn't, but many could. And I can just report in my own neighborhood the number of new people I have met
Mm.
as a result of that. And that, I think, is really the first thing, is actually understanding who your neighbors are and not being isolated. And I think city governments can play a role in that, and community organizations can play a role in that, in making sure that they are very deliberate about the type of outreach that they do, and really work at trying to meet people where they are and hear from them. So it's not just the putting a notice that the public meeting is here, but making sure that the public meeting is in a disabled place, or if you're a community leader or a government leader, that you go to the place where people are already meeting, with a guide from that community, somebody who knows that community, to help introduce you and to help moderate the discussion so that you get input. So really having a thorough and inclusive engagement process, I think is important for anyone. And if you are in a position of trying to create change in your neighborhood, that as an advocate, you also focus on really reaching out to everybody. One of the things the city of Seattle did, which I thought was really interesting, was we created neighborhood hubs for emergency management. And it was done under our emergency management director, Barb Graff. And what she did was she actually would meet with folks in a community and find out from them, where is the natural meeting place in your community? I mean, to ask people, if there were an emergency, where would you go to meet your neighbors? And in those places, we began installing emergency supplies, so that to help support people. You know, again, we think earthquake a lot here in Seattle. We're right on a major fault line. So that was a case that there was a combination. It was a partnership with the community about what emergency management would look like, rather than merely the city itself saying, well, here's what will happen in an emergency. And that was a way also bringing community members together to start thinking about what would be their own plans in an emergency. Like, for an example, you've been asking about short-term emergencies. We know in an earthquake, you're going to have to be self-reliant for at least a few days, if not a week or two. So bringing people together to recognize that your neighbor is going to probably have to be self-reliant too, and making sure that you're reaching out in that instance. I think bringing that same type of thinking to the very long-term emergency that is climate is also essential, right? We have to get out of this mindset right now that, I like my neighborhood the way it is, or I like my place the way it is, or I like my life the way it is, and somebody's suggesting that I change it. Well, there's a lot of people who are going to face a ton of stress, and they may already be facing that stress. And if we're going to meet that as a community, individuals are going to have to sacrifice some of their own comfort and privilege to make that happen. And that's challenging. And I tend to believe that people can do that, and when as collectively, maybe not everybody, but collectively we can do that if we're prepared to understand what's at stake. And anybody who thinks that things are, comfortable and nice for you right now, it's going to change.
Yeah.
That's what we know with climate. It's going to change. So the earlier we start kind of building the civic muscle and the community muscle to begin adapting the change, the stronger we'll be in dealing with those changes as they come forward.
Yeah, these climate issues do not discriminate. We have seen it with earthquakes out here, but also the fires that are burning throughout the West Coast, the hurricanes that affect the East Coast and the Southeast. So the importance of community is important for all of these issues.
And I also think we have to think about migration in the face of that, right? I mean, I think we can look across the globe and see that there are areas of the globe where people will be moving from. In our country, we know, there are the shorelines or places that are in storm paths, or places that may face excessive heat in the coming years, where people will look to move. So how do we make sure that we are in other communities actually being welcoming, that we have housing to accommodate people. Again, if it's in a walkable place with transit, that's much easier for people to make a transition from to a new place. And making those options available now, particularly in our high job areas. Like in our country, in this country, in Seattle, the housing prices are through the roof. And a
Right.
lot of that is because we just simply don't allow new housing. And people are going to come here for jobs. Um, we already have climate refugees. We don't like to think about it, but, we have a very big East African population. And one of the causes of strife in East Africa was a persistent drought, which created a lot of stress on the political systems, among other things. But climate was part of it. I think we saw in Syria the number of migrants leaving Syria, due to conflict, but that also was preceded by a drought that people had to move from farms to the cities. So if we don't build the structures to include people as they need to move and accommodate them and make them part of the community, we're just going to be facing conflict. And again, that's at a neighborhood scale, it's at a national scale, and it's at an international scale that we need to figure out how to accommodate people efficiently in places as we deal with these issues.
Speaking of migration, given the pandemic is affecting urban living, and
Yeah.
there's concern about physical space, as you're
Yeah.
alluding to. How is it likely to affect the initiatives that you're engaged with currently?
I think one of the things that we see about the pandemic is that if you looked at the number of, residences per acre, density, it's
Mhm.
actually not a very good predictor of the disease. What you tend to see is that the disease is affecting people more who live in crowded conditions or work in crowded workplaces. And many of them are folks who have to work because they have no other financial choice and or they are essential workers. Um, so the impact of the disease, like everything else, it just exposes the inequality in the system. So we are seeing, for example, farm workers in Eastern Washington who oftentimes live in much more crowded housing because they're migrant workers or they move to where the work is and have substandard housing. You see higher rates of the disease there. In South King County, which is where a lot of folks who've been gentrified out of Seattle have moved. You might have multi-generational households with multiple service workers traveling, to the city to support the service economy. That those are also populations and communities that are seeing the pandemic hit them more. Whereas if you can work from home and isolate yourself from others because you have that type of job and you have the space to do that, and maybe you don't have as many people in your household, you're not going to be that those demographics are not going to be hit the same. So it really brings home equity in how we provide public space and how we provide housing to everybody, right? That if we had a more ample supply of housing, again, an ample supply of transit so people could space better on transit, and all of those things, we'd be better off. Maya, it looks like you dropped off into the dark there.
Sorry, I'm in a room that had automatic light sensor. Here we are.
Okay, I say leave it in, Maya. So anyway, back to the point. Ample housing, um, ample transit, public spaces so people can get outside and enjoy public space without, while maintaining social distancing. And really at an even deeper level, the type of income supports and healthcare that really can support people so they don't feel the necessity to have to go to a workplace. So again, this is a place where some people with comfort and privilege have to give up some things in higher taxes or estate taxes or something in order to support, essential workers. Hey, essential, shouldn't we be really taking care of them?
So you mentioned politics. I don't want to get too involved in that right now, but we're at a critical time in American and world history, and we can see how politics can impact the most vulnerable. including those of color, the poor, and those with disabilities. What can we do to ensure that in the future their quality of life is sustained?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different. I mean, we've spoken about a number of those things.
Yeah.
Some financial. Whether it's guaranteed jobs for people who want to work, or basic maintenance of income for those in need, a robust healthcare system, fair taxation. All of those help level the playing field for people and help. And I'll make the argument that it's better for overall prosperity than the great division we're seeing. That causes so many other, that inequity and division causes far more costs in the long run to a society, not just to the individuals, but to all of us. I also think it speaks to, with these elections coming up, how important it is to really be getting everyone to the polls and that every vote is counted.
Yes.
Because I think that's another, we're proud that we have a democracy, but the reality is that there are folks who try to game the system by reducing the number of people that can vote, whether it's the number of polling places, whether it's when the polling places are open, whether it's taking away voting rights from certain people or purging the rolls if somebody hasn't voted in a few years. There's a wide variety of legal voter suppression methods that can be used to, empower the voices of those that already have against those that we really should be looking out for. So having, a functioning and stable democracy where everybody votes is more likely to get political leaders who are going to be thinking holistically rather than about, how do we give tax cuts to the wealthy, right? Or how do we protect the privileges of those that already have the privileges? We really need to be changing that debate. I guess I get hopeful sometimes when I see people organizing, and when I see the engagement of young people in the process. But they're showing up because the job that's been done isn't doing the job, and that's that they see the long-term rise in inequity, the sustenance and increase in racism that we've seen actually in this country, and the looming climate crisis. And I think the younger generations in particular, they see all of those things and they all see it kind of has the same root, which is some people are included and some people are not. And how do we make sure that everybody gets to share in what makes a great community, and that we're looking at the future of everybody, not on protecting whatever what some people may have accumulated in the past.
Before we run out of time, I want to bring up an area that I care about personally is children with disabilities.
Yeah.
Being in pediatric rehabilitation. And I believe that looking forward, this group will be most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. What would you recommend to parents of these children to help ensure that their futures are protected?
Well, I guess it's the same advice I give to everybody, which is organize and make noise around it. Like, do not hesitate to do it. Sometimes people think that if you're polite in politics, or that if you just merely explain the nature of the problem and other people see the problem, they'll respond to it. And one of the things I've learned over my years of political work is that that's just not how it works. Politicians and elected officials respond to demands from the public, and they don't respond to whoever is the most civil and nice to them. They respond to things that may affect their ability to get elected. And what that means, for some people, the way they affect the ability to get elected is they hand out lots of money to elected officials, and elected officials care about that because they have to run. They have to pay for their campaigns. So if you don't have a lot of money, you got to show up with a lot of voters. And the way you show up with voters is getting attention to your cause. And getting attention to your cause may mean that there's going to be a little pushback or claim that you're not behaving politely when you call out, when an advocate calls out what's wrong. And I think that can be particularly hard for people that already are used to being heard, are used to being able to reasonably explaining what the problem is and having a response. In other words, people with privilege often prize civility and reasonableness as the solution to problems. But if you're in politics, you realize that it turns on power, unfortunately, and that can sound like a dirty word, but people can create power by organizing, by sharing their ideas, by making sure the media hears them, and by building a base. And it's hard work, but it's essential. And I think connecting as we talked about earlier, connecting how we treat the most vulnerable and making the case that how we treat the most vulnerable is in fact how we ensure the success and prosperity of all of us. We're all going to be vulnerable at some point in our lives, and we all should be accepting of that and have some grace towards people that have vulnerabilities, because by building a place for them, we're building a place that really is a true community. And you just got to keep making the case, with nice persuasion and with calling and holding people accountable who refuse to actually invest in or pass the policies that will lead to greater equity. And I think that's part of why we see, I know in this country right now, we're looking at, a lot of people are dismayed by strife or incivility or protests, and they'd like it to go back to where, everybody's working together. But let's make a distinction between suppressing and quieting legitimate claims of inequity and legitimate demands for justice, from attempting to hear those legitimate claims and respond to those legitimate demands for justice. One, the suppressing merely defers the strife. It's not going to go away. Trying to meet it and respond to it is a way, again, that we start to build that civic attitude and that civic muscle to actually deal with further challenges that we're going to face. So, let's have an honest understanding of where the strife and incivility is coming from, right? It's not just people trying to be troublesome. There's real things that need to be solved. Let's focus on that, not on that surface level of it makes me or it makes my neighbors uncomfortable, that we have this.
So this is our second year for A Day for Tomorrow. So will you join us next year to continue to raise awareness for climate justice and recognize these issues of great concern so that we can integrate these ideas as part of our community responsibility?
Well, if you think I've got anything to offer, I'm willing to take another shot at it. And I got to give a plug for my organization here, America Walks. What we do is we support local organizers in their communities, and train them and teach them how to be more effective advocates. And we take a very expansive view of what a walkable community is. So to me, it's walking and moving and rolling. It's one that embraces the universal design elements we've spoken about. It's inclusive. It recognizes that if someone's different, they should feel proud to be out on the street, and they should not feel because they are, an immigrant or a person of color, they should not have to feel fear in their community. So we have a vision of America, which is that inclusive, equitable, and shared commitment to the health of and prosperity of our neighbors.
Thank you
Join
so
us
much.
at America Walks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Maya.